Okay, today we're going to go over the major episodes in the history of life. And remember, the Earth is about 4.5 billion years old, and life has been around for about 3.5 billion years. And we're going to go through that huge amount of time pretty quickly. We're going to cover 4.5 billion years in maybe 4.5 minutes, maybe a little longer. But you can see here's a quick timeline of origin of the Earth, about 4.6 billion years ago. And then again, 3.5 billion years ago, the oldest prokaryotes, bacteria appear, and then things get more and more complex. You can see animal and fungus don't appear till relatively recently, right up here at about 600 million years ago. So if we make a clock analogy, in other words, what does 4.6 billion mean? Well, let's turn it into sort of like a 12-hour clock. You can see that for a good part of about 20% of the history of the Earth, there was no life at all. And then bacteria have been around really for about 80% of the time. And if we look at animals come in fairly late. Dinosaurs, this Mesozoic era is the era of dinosaurs. The era of mammals is this Cenozoic era right here, and then humans right there at the very end. We are very late on the scene in terms of history of life. If we do go back 3.5 billion years to the first life forms, they were bacteria, and they looked a lot like these bacteria. These are bacteria at a hydrothermal vent on the bottom of the ocean. Now, there's a lot of heat coming out. This is sort of magma bubbling up from the Earth. So there's a lot of heat. The water outside of that is very cold, so it's a very extreme environment. There's no oxygen, but there are a lot of chemicals coming up. So these bacteria were what we call chemosynthetic. They eat chemicals, and they do it without oxygen present. And they believe the first bacteria to ever evolve were this type of anaerobic chemosynthetic chemical-eating bacteria that could live in these really harsh, extreme environments that existed about 3.5 billion years ago. And if we look, again, since bacteria are asexual and don't reproduce sexually, they haven't changed a whole lot in the past 3.5 billion years. Now, one thing about evolution is you don't have to go from simple to complex. If you're a simple structure and it works well, that'll do fine, right? So bacteria, if we look at photosynthetic bacteria today and the first photosynthetic bacteria about 2.7 billion years ago, we can see they're about the same. Not a whole lot of change there. So moving forward, the first bacteria appear. They're chemosynthetic. They're chemical eaters. They exist for about 1 billion years, and they pretty much eat up all the available chemicals in the environment. The methane, the ammonia, the energy-rich molecules that get depleted, and so there becomes an advantage for photosynthetic bacteria, those that can make energy from the sun. Again, a renewable resource. We're not going to run out of the sun energy for about another 5 billion years or so. So those photosynthetic organisms appear again about 2.7 billion years ago, and what do? They produce this waste product called oxygen. Now that's a huge, huge disruption to the Earth. The Earth had no oxygen, and these guys start just spewing out huge amounts of oxygen. That causes the first massive extinction. It's a revolution, the oxygen revolution. And it also allows organisms that can use that oxygen to burn their food more efficiently, right? Aerobic respiration allows organisms like animals to get a lot more energy out of their food. So this production of oxygen by these first photosynthetic bacteria has huge ramifications later on down the road because it allows for aerobic respiration after it, of course, kills and poisons a lot of these early bacteria that just couldn't deal with that oxygen environment. Okay, how do we know that oxygen appeared there? Well, we can see in the strata that goes back about 2.7 billion years, we start to see that iron exists as rust, as iron oxide. So the oxygen in the atmosphere is combining with iron, just like it does today, to form rust. And we don't see that rust in the strata until about 2.7 billion years. Okay. Moving forward about 1.5 billion years or 1.45 billion years, we start to see that multicellular organisms start to appear. So eukaryotes with a nucleus and even many cells appear. And what also happens here, which is important, is they start to reproduce sexually. They start mixing up their genes and creating a lot of new combinations. And that's important because that leads to variation, and that variation accelerates the rate of evolution and allows for much more rapid evolution and many new forms to appear. And again, you can see in the past 500 million years, we get this explosion of life, all these sexually reproducing organisms producing all kinds of forms. Many of them die out and go extinct, but a lot of them continue to survive and flourish. So we look going back, we're in the last billion years here, and really the last half billion years, 580 million years ago, is what was called the Cambrian explosion. Cambria means life, and this is when all of a sudden the fossil record just explodes with all these organisms. And what might you see if you go back 500 million years? Well, you'd see fossils of these things called trilobites, and you'd see other aquatic organisms. Everything was still in the oceans at this point, swimming around, but there was just a huge number of different organisms. And moving on, what we see over the past 500 million years is that extinctions are not a recent phenomenon. Extinctions have been occurring throughout time. Okay, so after this explosion of life in the Cambrian, we see a huge increase in extinctions. A lot of those forms that appeared didn't work or outcompeted other forms and they went extinct. And we see that the number of species has steadily increased, and as it's increased, periodic extinctions have sort of culled back the number of species. But we can see that today, even given our modern situation, we do have high levels of extinction, but those levels of extinction aren't really as high as some that have existed back even before humans existed. So extinctions have been coming and going, high and low rates throughout history. Important evolutionary adaptation about 365 million years ago is the first aquatic organisms moved onto land. And they looked a little bit like this guy right here. This is a drawing of them. And they were fish with sort of lobed fins that they could walk on and move from the water onto the land. And looking a little bit like our alligators that we have today in Louisiana. So moving forward, from 245 to 65 million years ago, this is what's called the Middle Era or the Mesozoic era. We break that down into the Triassic, the Jurassic, and Cretaceous. You've probably heard of the movie Jurassic Park. That was one of the periods of the Mesozoic era. And this era was ruled by the dinosaurs, the really large reptiles. You guys all know what dinosaurs are. There's a bunch of them here on this diagram. So this Middle Era was ruled by these large reptiles, dinosaurs. Mammals existed at this point, but they weren't a dominant species. They weren't large herbivores and large predators. They were basically small, sort of weasel-like guys that were nocturnal and just tried to stay out of the way of the dinosaurs. Not major species at all. 65 million years ago, there is major disruption. One thing that we know happened is a meteorite slammed into the Yucatan Peninsula. That's just on the other side of the Gulf of Mexico from where we are, and put a huge amount of debris in the air. Recent discoveries have shown that some dinosaurs actually survived that meteorite. So what a lot of scientists think today is that meteorite may have been a sort of a damaging blow, crippling blow to dinosaurs, and then there was a lot of volcanic activity that occurred shortly after that meteorite that just finished them off. And so that those that did survive a meteorite crash couldn't survive that continued unstable conditions and volcanic activity. Remember, all this debris going in the air, the volcanoes and the meteorites, clouds out the sun and makes it very cold and creates sort of what we call a nuclear winter, like if a nuclear bomb goes off. All that debris clouds the earth and makes it very cold. And that spells the end of the dinosaurs, but that's good news for mammals, because now there's all these niches that used to be held by the dinosaurs that the mammals can then fill. And we see rapid evolution of mammals after 65 million years. Okay? Humans, again, we didn't appear, modern humans, until about 200,000 years ago, and you'll see on the timeline activity that that was just kind of a slice back in your timeline, right? Just a hair back from the present. Some of the reasons humans have been so successful is our large brain, and in the next video you'll see a video about why they think we might have had that large brain. But that's it for today. Oops.